There's a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from any single event, and this is exactly what makes it so difficult to explain to anyone who hasn't lived through it. It isn't the tiredness that follows a hard day at work, or the fatigue after a difficult conversation. It's something considerably more diffuse, harder to point to, harder to justify, because when you try to explain it, there's rarely one clear incident you can offer as evidence. Just an accumulated bone-deep weariness that seems to have arrived from nowhere, even though it actually arrived from somewhere very specific. Months or years of small, repeated erosions, each one too minor on its own to seem worth mentioning, together adding up to something that eventually starts to feel like your entire sense of self has been slowly, quietly, worn down to almost nothing. This is what we're exploring today, and I want to frame it precisely, because understanding exactly how this wearing down happens, mechanism by mechanism, is what finally makes it possible to name what's actually happening to you, rather than continuing to wonder, as so many people do, whether you're simply too sensitive, too tired, too unable to handle ordinary relationship difficulty. What we're describing today isn't ordinary difficulty. It's a specific, cumulative process, and by the end of this, you'll understand exactly how it operates piece by piece and why it produces exhaustion so much deeper than any single incident could ever explain on its own. Let's start with the first mechanism, because it's foundational to everything else this exploration will trace: the constant, low-grade demand for interpretation. Remember something worth understanding as a basic feature of these dynamics, one we've touched on throughout other explorations in this series. Narcissists often communicate through ambiguity rather than clarity, not necessarily because they're incapable of speaking directly, but because ambiguity keeps the burden of understanding permanently placed on you rather than on them. A mood shift with no stated cause, a comment that could mean several different things depending on tone, depending on context, depending on nothing you can actually verify, a silence that might mean anger, might mean nothing at all, might mean something you're expected to somehow already know. Here's what's worth understanding about why this specific mechanism wears people down so thoroughly, even though any single instance of ambiguity seems minor on its own. Every ambiguous moment requires interpretive labor, active mental work spent trying to determine what's actually happening, what response is actually being called for, what you might have done wrong, if anything, in order to produce whatever shift you're currently trying to decode. This labor happens constantly, throughout ordinary days, layered on top of everything else already requiring your attention, and it rarely gets acknowledged as labor at all, precisely because it happens internally, invisibly, without any obvious external marker that might otherwise signal how much energy it's actually consuming. This is worth understanding as fundamentally different from the ordinary effort required in healthy relationships, where communication, even when imperfect, tends to move toward clarity over time, rather than remaining perpetually ambiguous by design. In healthy relationships, unclear moments get clarified, questions get answered directly, confusion gets resolved through actual conversation. In the dynamic we're describing, ambiguity doesn't resolve. It simply continues, moment after moment, requiring the same interpretive labor over and over, without ever actually building toward genuine clarity, because genuine clarity was never actually the goal in the first place. Let's talk about the second mechanism, one that compounds directly with the first: the unpredictable timing of emotional shifts, arriving without any pattern reliable enough to anticipate or prepare for. This is worth understanding precisely, because unpredictability itself functions as a specific kind of exhausting labor, considerably different from simply dealing with someone whose moods are consistently difficult. A consistently difficult mood, however unpleasant, at least allows for some degree of preparation, some sense of what to expect and how to navigate it. Genuine unpredictability offers no such preparation. It requires constant, ongoing vigilance, a kind of perpetual scanning for signals that might indicate which version of this person you're about to encounter. Vigilance that never fully switches off, because switching it off even briefly risks being caught unprepared for whatever shift might be coming next. This is worth understanding as a genuine, measurable cost, not simply an inconvenience. Sustained vigilance of this kind draws on the same limited cognitive and emotional resources required for everything else in your life, work, other relationships, your own basic well-being, and because this vigilance operates continuously in the background, whether or not you're consciously aware of maintaining it, it produces exactly the kind of diffuse, hard-to-explain exhaustion we open this exploration by naming. You're not tired because of any single demanding moment. You're tired because a significant portion of your mental and emotional resources has been permanently allocated toward monitoring an unpredictable environment, resources that would otherwise be available for genuine rest, genuine presence, genuine engagement with the rest of your life. Let's introduce a third mechanism, one that connects to something we've traced extensively throughout this series, but deserves specific attention here as its own distinct wearing down process. The gradual redefinition of your own needs as excessive, unreasonable, or somehow inconvenient, delivered not through any single dramatic accusation, but through countless small, repeated signals that accumulate over time into a genuine, internalized belief. A sigh when you express a preference, a subtle eye roll when you mention something bothering you. A pattern of your concerns being met with visible impatience rather than genuine engagement, repeated often enough that you eventually stop bringing up most things at all, not because they've stopped mattering to you, but because the accumulated cost of raising them has come to feel greater than the relief of finally being heard. What we haven't yet explored are the remaining mechanisms that complete this wearing down process, how they work together rather than as isolated, separate experiences, and what this accumulated understanding actually reveals about why this specific kind of exhaustion feels so different, so much harder to explain or justify to others than any ordinary difficulty a relationship might reasonably produce. Let's talk about the fourth mechanism, one that builds directly on the third and deepens its effect considerably: the slow substitution of your own emotional needs with the ongoing management of theirs. This is worth understanding precisely because it rarely announces itself as an explicit trade, some clear moment where your needs get formally exchanged for the responsibility of managing someone else's. It happens gradually, through countless small moments where a conversation that started as your genuine concern quietly redirects toward comforting them instead, where your own bad day gets set aside because their mood requires more immediate attention, where the emotional bandwidth you might have spent processing your own experience instead gets absorbed by monitoring and soothing theirs. Here's what's worth understanding about why this substitution is so exhausting in a way that's difficult to fully convey to someone who hasn't lived through it. Emotional labor spent on your own genuine needs tends to produce something in return: relief, resolution, a sense of having actually been heard and supported. Emotional labor spent managing someone else's needs repeatedly at the expense of your own produces no such return. It simply depletes continuously, without replenishment, because the entire structure of the relationship has quietly reorganized itself around one person's emotional state, mattering considerably more than the others. This depletion compounds over time, precisely because it never gets balanced by anything flowing back in the opposite direction, and this one-directional flow, sustained for months or years, is worth understanding as one of the most significant contributors to the exhaustion this entire exploration has been tracing from its very beginning. Let's talk about the fifth mechanism, one that connects to something we've discussed throughout other explorations in this series: the erosion of your own decision-making confidence, produced not through any single dramatic undermining, but through repeated, small instances of your choices being questioned, second-guessed, or subtly criticized in ways that never quite rise to the level of open conflict. A comment about how you handled something, delivered with just enough plausible deniability that objecting to it would seem like an overreaction. A pattern of your decisions being met with visible skepticism rather than trust, repeated often enough that you eventually start second-guessing yourself before anyone else even has the chance to. This is worth understanding as genuinely exhausting in a way that extends far beyond the specific relationship itself, because eroded decision-making confidence doesn't stay neatly contained to interactions with this one person. It bleeds into everything. Work decisions that once felt straightforward now require extensive internal deliberation. Simple choices that used to happen automatically now trigger genuine anxiety, a general, pervasive uncertainty about your own judgment that makes ordinary daily life considerably more effortful than it should be. This is worth naming directly because it explains why so many people in these relationships report feeling exhausted even by tasks entirely unrelated to the relationship itself, tasks that used to require no particular effort at all, precisely because the underlying confidence that once made those tasks effortless has been quietly, systematically worn away. Let's talk about the sixth and final mechanism worth naming directly here, one that ties together everything we've traced throughout this exploration into its most complete and most exhausting form: the constant low-grade suppression of your own authentic reactions, because expressing them honestly has repeatedly produced conflict, dismissal, or consequences disproportionate to whatever you actually expressed. This suppression happens gradually, the same way everything else in this exploration has developed gradually, one small moment of holding back at a time, until holding back becomes so automatic that you barely notice yourself doing it anymore, even though the effort required to maintain this suppression continues, invisibly, constantly, underneath everything else you're managing throughout an ordinary day. Here's what's worth understanding about why suppressing authentic reaction is so exhausting, considerably more exhausting than most people realize until they finally stop doing it. Genuine, emotional expression, even difficult expression, tends to actually resolve something internally, releasing tension that would otherwise remain trapped, unprocessed, requiring ongoing energy simply to keep contained. Suppressed reaction doesn't resolve. It accumulates, layer after layer, requiring continuous energy just to keep it from surfacing, energy that's being spent constantly, silently, throughout every single day. This pattern continues, whether or not you're consciously aware of spending it. Let's bring all six of these mechanisms together now, because understanding them as a coherent, interconnected system, rather than six separate, disconnected difficulties, is what actually explains the specific bone-deep exhaustion this entire exploration opened by naming. Constant interpretive labor around ambiguous communication, sustained vigilance against unpredictable emotional shifts, the gradual redefinition of your needs as unreasonable, the substitution of your own emotional needs with managing theirs, eroded confidence in your own decision-making, and continuous suppression of authentic reaction. All six of these operate simultaneously, continuously, compounding rather than simply adding together because each one draws on the same limited pool of emotional and cognitive resources, leaving considerably less available for genuine rest, genuine presence, or genuine engagement with anything else in your life. This brings us to the final and most important part of this exploration, the one where we need to address what this comprehensive understanding actually means for you specifically, why naming these mechanisms precisely matters considerably more than simply knowing, in general terms, that the relationship has been difficult, and what genuine recovery from this specific, accumulated form of exhaustion actually requires. Let's talk about why naming these six mechanisms precisely matters so much more than simply knowing, in general terms, that the relationship has been difficult, because this distinction is genuinely important for how you approach your own recovery from here. Vague understanding, the general sense that something was wrong, that the relationship was exhausting, that you're not entirely sure why you feel so depleted, tends to produce vague, ineffective responses. Rest that doesn't quite restore, boundaries that don't quite hold, self-care that addresses symptoms without ever reaching the actual mechanisms causing the depletion in the first place. Precise understanding, the kind we've built throughout this entire exploration, allows for something considerably more effective. Targeted recovery, addressed specifically to each of the 6 mechanisms we've traced, rather than generic rest applied broadly and hoping it happens to help. Here's what this looks like in practice: addressing each mechanism specifically, rather than treating exhaustion as a single, undifferentiated problem. For the constant interpretive labor around ambiguous communication, recovery requires deliberately seeking out relationships and environments characterized by genuine clarity, where communication moves toward resolution rather than remaining perpetually ambiguous, allowing your mind to finally rest from the constant decoding it's grown so accustomed to performing. For the sustained vigilance against unpredictable emotional shifts, recovery requires deliberately, repeatedly practicing environments where you don't need to monitor anyone's mood, noticing, often with genuine surprise, how much mental space becomes available once this constant scanning finally has permission to switch off. For the gradual redefinition of your needs as unreasonable, recovery requires actively, deliberately practicing the expression of genuine needs in contexts where they'll actually be received well, rebuilding the evidence base that your needs were never actually excessive, simply unwelcome in a specific, narrow context that never should have been treated as representative of what you deserve more broadly. For the substitution of your own emotional needs with managing theirs, recovery requires deliberately redirecting emotional attention back toward yourself, sometimes with real discomfort at first, because attending to your own needs after so long spent attending primarily to someone else's can feel unfamiliar, even selfish, even though it's simply restoring something that should never have been redirected away from you in the first place. For eroded decision-making confidence, recovery requires deliberate, repeated practice making decisions independently, starting small if necessary, and consciously noticing when those decisions turn out fine, building gradually the same kind of accumulated evidence we've discussed throughout other explorations in this series. Evidence that your own judgment remains genuinely trustworthy despite however long it's been treated otherwise. And for the continuous suppression of authentic reaction, recovery requires deliberately, gradually practicing genuine expression again, ideally in relationships and contexts where that expression will actually be received with genuine interest rather than dismissal or conflict, allowing you to relearn slowly that authentic reaction doesn't have to be dangerous, that it can simply be received, ordinarily the way it always should have been. Let's talk about something important worth naming directly here, because it addresses a common frustration many people experience once they've identified these 6 mechanisms clearly. The sense that understanding them should produce faster recovery than it actually does. This is worth addressing honestly, because precise understanding, valuable as it genuinely is, doesn't instantly reverse months or years of accumulated depletion. Each of these 6 mechanisms took considerable time to produce the exhaustion you're currently carrying, and reversing them, rebuilding what they've worn down, similarly requires considerable time, considerable patience, and considerable tolerance for a recovery process that's likely to feel gradual and uneven rather than sudden and complete. Here's the deepest insight worth carrying forward from everything we've traced across this entire exploration, one that ties together not just this specific video, but so much of what this entire series has explored throughout its full length. The exhaustion you've been carrying was never a sign of your own weakness, your own inability to handle ordinary relationship difficulty, or your own oversensitivity to things that shouldn't have affected you as deeply as they did. It was the direct, predictable, entirely reasonable result of 6 specific, cumulative mechanisms, operating simultaneously over an extended period, drawing continuously on resources that were never meant to be spent this way, this consistently, for this long. So if there's one thing worth carrying forward from everything we've explored throughout this entire series, let it be this: you weren't too sensitive. You weren't too tired for ordinary life. You were carrying 6 simultaneous, invisible burdens: constant interpretation, sustained vigilance, redefined needs, redirected emotional attention, eroded confidence, and continuous suppression, any single one of which would be exhausting on its own, and all 6 of which, together, explain completely and entirely why you feel the way you feel, without requiring any further wondering about whether your exhaustion was somehow disproportionate to what actually happened. It wasn't disproportionate at all. It was precisely proportionate to everything you were quietly, invisibly carrying, for far longer than anyone should ever have to carry it alone.